I am really excited to have the most censored oncologist maybe ever come in and talk about some things. This will just full preference. It's condensed down and pretty vague a little bit on some of the reasons behind, just so we don't get censored and are able to get the message out to more people. We'll have a link to the follow-up as we dive into the nitty-gritty. Dr. Makis, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I think that you might be the most censored oncologist of all times, and we'll get into kind of why later. But at first, I want to kind of tell your story and the approach that you've used in what seems to be a new variety of cancer. So your story is fascinating in that as an immigrant and the struggles and hard work you put in. So it's just brilliant. So if you don't care, just kind of lay that out.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. I was born in communist Czechoslovakia, and my family fled communism in 1988 through a United Nations refugee camp in Yugoslavia. So we were put in a refugee camp. We stayed there for about a year. I learned English there. And we didn't know where we were going to end up. We ended up applying at the Canadian consulate. We were accepted. And so we came to Canada in 1989. I grew up in Toronto. I did all my schooling in Toronto. I went to University of Toronto and got a 4-year immunology degree. So I have 4 years of immunology background. And then went to medical school at McGill University in Montreal. It's best medical school in Canada. And I obtained a 5-year specialization in nuclear medicine, radiology, and oncology. So it's a branch of radiology that deals specifically with cancer. And so anything to do with radiation and cancer, that was my specialization. And so I've been practicing for 14 years. Now in Canada, I ran a very large cancer treatment program. We were curing end-stage cancer patients. These were neuroendocrine cancer patients. We were curing about 85 to 90% of end-stage cancer patients with targeted radiation, targeted radionuclide therapy. This is a form of radiation that's attached to molecules that deliver radioactive particles directly to tumor cells and then kill the tumor cell and leaves, the rest of the healthy tissues alone. And so we were experimenting with that. It was highly successful. It had been developed in Europe. The FDA had been sitting on it for 20 years, not wanting to approve it because it would cut into the chemotherapy budgets. Imagine curing stage 4 cancer, without the need for chemo. That was just not going to fly, right? And so my cancer program ended up getting sabotaged by health bureaucrats that were loyal to Justin Trudeau. And it turned out a couple of years later that the Trudeau government started copying my cancer program in Vancouver, British Columbia, poured about $300 million into it, monopolized it in Canada, so only they could have access to the technology. And so it's one of the huge scandals in Canadian medical history. And unfortunately, I got swept up right in the middle of it because I was at the wrong place at the wrong time using the wrong cancer treatments. And so that's kind of the story of my career and my life.
Well, you're putting out absolutely incredible work, and I have learned so much from you. So, my son being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer when he was 5 was my whole reason for getting into the podcast and learning and how we apply things. And so that has led me down, a lot of different rabbit trails, but it's been beautiful in a way that we've been able to help people, right? Like, and he's doing great. We got scans coming up, so that anxiety with that's going. But you're talking about some things that don't cost anything that may very well have an amazing impact on cancer. And I want us to go into that because every single day I am seeing a new diagnosis of very aggressive cancer. Wow, all of a sudden it's a stage 4 and things that just seem to be different, right? Now I want us to get into why later, but what is kind of that approach or that first awareness that we should have with a new diagnosis of cancer?
Well, one thing to realize is that, and this is actually very, very important, is that oncologists actually have their hands tied when you're in front of them and when they're basically assessing your situation. Now, oncologists, they're pretty good at getting a diagnosis, getting staging. You get the biopsy for the tumor, you figure out what the tumor cells are like, how aggressive they are, how quickly they replicate, how quickly the tumor replicates, and where the tumor is located. And they work together with radiologists to get a diagnosis. Once you have a diagnosis, though, the approach in traditional medicine is that you try surgery to get as much of the tumor out as possible, right? Now, sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not possible, but that's always the first treatment approach. Let's say in breast cancer, they find a 1 centimeter tumor. The first thing they're always going to do is they're going to offer surgery to get that tumor out, right? And they're going to look for lymph nodes, see if there's any tumor in the lymph nodes, and if there is, they'll remove those surgically. So that is always the first approach. And I think people have to understand that there's a certain sequence in the types of treatments that you're going to be offered. Surgery is always going to be the first one. Now, if surgery is not possible or if the cancer is advanced, that's when you start getting into things like chemotherapy, radiation therapy, maybe an immunotherapy, depends on the type of cancer and so on. And this is where the oncologists are very limited to what they've been allowed to basically offer their patients from the medical authorities, the medical boards, the medical associations. So you've got the American Cancer Association, for example, will put out protocols for oncologists to follow, and they have to follow those protocols. They're not going to veer off the protocol, right? So you'll get your first line chemotherapy, second line chemotherapy. You might get some experimental treatments, but you will not get offered anything else. And I've realized, especially with the recent surge in cancer and particularly aggressive cancers, that you need an alternative treatment approach. The standard treatment approach is not going to cut it. There are too many people who are not responding to traditional chemotherapy or radiation therapy. And as you mentioned, we can sort of go into the details of that, why that is later on. But there's a lot of people who are not responding to the standard treatments, and your oncologist will simply not offer you anything else. Once they've exhausted those traditional approaches, first line, second line chemo, and so on, maybe some radiation, maybe the occasional experimental treatment like an immunotherapy, once they've exhausted those and the cancer continues to grow, they literally will say, we have nothing else to offer you. And effectively, they send you home to die. And that's just not acceptable to me, because a lot of these cases can actually be cured. There are people who were sent home to die who then went on to take an alternative treatment approach, and they cured their stage 4 cancer. There are many, there are thousands of cases like this. So the question is, well, how do you find what is an alternative treatment approach? How do you find an alternative treatment approach? And that's what I've been trying to put together. In my Substack, do articles about, and I'll give you an example of the very first thing that I would start with for any cancer patient. The first thing I would start with is you eliminate sugar from your diet. You eliminate sugar from your diet as much as possible, preferably something like a ketogenic diet. The reason being is that cancer thrives on sugar. The vast majority of cancers, I would say, close to 90% of cancers just absolutely thrive on sugar. They consume sugar, they use it as fuel. And in radiology, actually, one of the cutting edge diagnostics for cancer is something called FDG, positron emission tomography, PET-CT. And the FDG is fluorodeoxyglucose. It's an analog of glucose that the body can't actually break down. So the body will take it up like glucose, thinks, hey, there's sugar. So the cancer takes it up in large quantities, and you light up like a Christmas tree on the scan. And the black dots where the radioactive sugar has been taken up, it's been taken up by the cancers. That's how you see the cancer. So cancer takes up sugar at much higher levels than most body tissues. That's how you're able to recognize it. And so you want to cut off that energy source, for that cancer. So that's the number one thing. And again, that's a very simple thing to do. And,
Yeah.
and oncologists won't even suggest that. Right now, that's just that's
Yeah.
just the first step. You try to cut off the sugar, starve the cancer. The oncologist will say, well, that doesn't do anything or that doesn't work. It does, but it's an important part of an alternative treatment approach. The next thing I suggest is prolonged fasting. Prolonged fasting, and it's been shown. I just did a very popular article recently about this on my Substack. Prolonged fasting, when I say prolonged, I mean 72 hours. You need a minimum of 48 hours to show just, some kind of benefit, preferably 72 hours. And what you're doing is you're causing changes in your metabolism that will impact the cancer. There's a process in the body called autophagy that only kicks in about 36 to 48 hours into a fast. And when I talk about fast, I mean a water fast, where you're not eating anything, you're drinking just water, maybe a little bit of electrolytes, maybe some black coffee or plain tea, but that's it, right? You want to go into that ketosis. And once you're 48 hours into a fast, your body kicks in this process called autophagy, where it starts to remove damaged components of cells or damaged cells altogether and starts to remove them. It removes precancerous cells, it removes cancer cells, and so on. And, they've done this. The research that's been done usually focuses on doing fasting with chemotherapy. Right, and it makes the chemotherapy way more effective. Would
That be the insulin potentiated chemotherapy?
Any kind of chemotherapy,
Yeah.
it makes it a lot more effective, and it also reduces side effects. And one of the things, for example, is it reduces the need for dexamethasone and steroids, because sometimes they'll give you steroids with chemotherapy because you can have severe nausea and vomiting and so on. So they give you steroids, but actually spikes your sugar, which actually is feeding the cancer at the same time. It's this kind of a, interesting phenomenon where they're trying to help you, but they're hurting you by giving you steroids at the same time. And so, for example, it eliminates the need for steroids completely, right? Now, the reason why they do research combining fasting and chemotherapy is because chemo is how they make money, right? And so if there even is an alternative treatment approach that the oncologists will look at, they will only look at it in the context of, well, how can I make money off this? Well, you combine it with chemo, right? But you can do it on your own. You can do these fasting sessions by themselves. You could do 72-hour fast, a few weeks later, repeat the 72-hour fast again, and so on. And so again, you're hitting the cancer from a completely different angle and perspective. You don't need any supplements. It doesn't cost any money, right? We get attacked in this space. If you're suggesting any kind of alternative treatment approaches, you get attacked that, oh, you're some kind of a grifter and you're selling some product. I'm not selling anything, right? And fasting is something that everyone can do, and it's free. And no one's going to get rich by suggesting that you fast, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
the pharmaceutical companies are not going to get rich. The alternative cancer treatment practitioners no one's going to get rich by suggesting fasting, but it's an extremely important component of this, alternative approach.
As I've been trying to piece together the cancer puzzle, been able to talk to so many different people with different trains of thoughts. Thomas Seyfried was really got me on that whole metabolic aspect, and then opening the door for looking at like Fenbendazole, Naisha Winters with her approach, even, throwing mistletoe, a lot of the ketogenic diets and ways she looks at it. Laszlo Boros with the deuterium, and, just on and on, just being able to package it together. So how have you been able to view cancer? Like in your experience or idea, what is cancer? Do you prescribe more to the somatic cell theory or genetic? What is cancer in your view?
That's a very interesting question, because there's a lot of theories, right? So for a very long time, I believed in the theory that, well, it's probably mostly genetics, maybe a combination of genetics and environment, but you get a genetic predisposition of some kind, right? And then let's say you have a flaw in your p53 tumor suppressor gene, or what have you, and so that predisposes you to cancer in the future, right? Because your body already doesn't have a proper way to deal with mutated cells, and at some point that's going to develop into cancer. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. Certainly they're finding impaired genes of various kinds in people with various cancers. They're finding new mutations in lung cancer and colon cancer, and that makes it attractive in mainstream oncology. That's very attractive, because if you can design a drug to target a specific mutation or the effects of that mutation, then you're gonna make a pile of money, right? And I think people have to understand that in medicine, money is more important than patients, right? I mean, it's unfortunate, but it's money usually tends to come first. The sort of the honest physicians usually get sidelined or eventually pushed out of medicine altogether, right? And so everything is about money, money, money. And so, but again, I do like the metabolic aspect of it. I think that's I think that's very important as well. So, I mean, to answer your question, I don't know what the correct answer is. Is it a combination of things? I don't know. But what I do know is that the way cancer is being treated right now, for the most part, doesn't work. I mean, if you can, let's say you get a stage 1, there are certain cancers that they know how to treat fairly well, right? Certain lymphomas, breast cancer, prostate cancer, especially in the early stages, it seems like, when you get the standard oncology approach, let's take stage 1 breast cancer, right? You get the surgical removal and so on. Your 5-year survival is like 95, 98%. That's pretty good, right? But again, there's a lot of cancers where they haven't made much headway, right? Once you get, let's say, to more advanced, like lung cancers or sarcomas and so on, the treatments just suck. The response to chemo is pretty poor. Long-term prognosis is pretty poor. Things like, brain cancers, glioblastomas, things like pancreatic cancers, which still have very poor prognosis, decades later. They just haven't been able to figure anything out. And so, I really like this metabolic aspect to cancer. There's a lot we just don't understand. And that's what shocks me about mainstream oncology right now in North America. Now, this is not the case in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they will try different alternative approaches. And you see that in the literature. They will try medicinal mushrooms. They will try things like soursop or apricot seeds, or foods with bioactive compounds, garlic, ginger, right? Even something like chlorine dioxide, for example. They will try things in other parts of the world that they will not try in North America. That they will simply not touch them in North America, right? And again, it comes down to money. Can you make money off it? Can you not make money off it, right? Medicinal mushrooms like turkey tail mushroom, right? Or reishi mushroom. They won't even look at it here in North America because, again, how do you make money off it, right? But in other parts of the world, practitioners are much more open in combining treatments with bioactive compounds. And we're still trying to understand how those bioactive compounds even work, right? But that's why I think it's important to try those alternative approaches and not leave yourself in the hands of a mainstream oncologist who's only going to give you things that big pharma makes money on and will not really offer you anything else beyond that.
Yeah. I think I'm with you. I'm with you. But for the most part, I have come to the conclusion based off of so many different facets coming together and seeing very early on when Lander was diagnosed, I was reached out to another pediatric cancer patient, and he put me in contact with this alternative practitioner, and that really opened my eyes because he was talking about all kinds of things. And this was 2019. So Nicholas Gonzalez, his work was right out of the gate. And so I'm trying to understand enzymes and coffee enemas and all these things that just seemed way out there. But where I have come to through all the different trails is I sincerely believe that disease is going to be an energy deficiency or insufficiency. And whether that is from toxicities, deficiencies, some sort of a parasitic overload, heavy metals, just on and on and on, right? Something's causing the mitochondria to not produce enough energy, and things are just out of whack. Are you familiar with, I believe it was 2021, Israel put out a study where every single biopsy contained a fungal presence. There's fungus in every single cancer. Now, whether it was there and caused it, or if it was a cleanup mechanism, or whatever it is, I don't know. But I think that may be part of why so many of these anti-parasitics and antifungals have an efficacy in treatment. So I said all that to say this. Cancer, while I was looking at it in 19, is different from the cancer in 2024. And so I want to get into that. So I think from here, we're going to let you just open up and say absolutely whatever you want, whatever you believe. And we'll have to have that one on another platform. And I'll link to it in the descriptions and all that, but it will be censored, this conversation, on YouTube. So with that, you take the floor, my friend, and let's get into what cancer is now and how are we going to overcome this disease. Thank you for joining us on Sowing Prosperity. Be sure to follow along across the social media platforms, including YouTube, and be sure to go to sowingprosperity.com.